Evolve 360, a holistic approach to life, is an exploration of learning through experience to transform individually and culturally as a whole by taking a 360-degree look at our quality of life, including the limiting beliefs, worn-out paradigms, and destructive habits that have led us to where we are today, and to instead create or revolutionize a new life vision that brings greater peace, appreciation, fulfillment, clarity, happiness, and joy as we ultimately evolve. In our last 3 episodes, Shelley and I took you on a 360-degree life view by exploring the micro level of intimate power plays we have in marriage and divorce, and the importance of communication and negotiation. Then we went into the workforce to see more clearly how the tiny choices we make have an impact on the macro level, where we experience the same power plays in our careers, our country, and beyond. If anything, it shows us that we can't help but begin to acknowledge that as human beings, we are creative seekers of freedom and independence, and that we all have dreams of a better quality of life, but struggle with our creative capabilities to achieve that because of the myths and tales we tell ourselves, and even more compelling, a history we have yet to learn from so that we can navigate our future. So Shelley and I are going to take you on a journey into the birth of our nation. So this episode is the introduction of a 5-part series on the sacred contract of America. So let's dive in. Welcome to the Evolve 360 show with
Cheli Grace
and Shelley Devine. Hey, soul sister.
Hey, soul sister. How are you?
I'm doing great. I'm so excited about this upcoming series.
Oh
I mean, like, it's fireworks. Kaboom, kaboom, kaboom.
I feel the same way. It's just so energizing, and especially with what's going on right now in history. And boy, you live right there where things started. Things started right where you're at. You're like at the point of entry for everything America. And I just can't wait to just get into this show. We have been doing some major research. And what I was telling Shelley is that when I was going to school, sometimes you don't pay attention because you just, you don't find it so enticing. But boy, did I just, eat it all up as we were doing the research for the next several episodes that we're kicking off for Sacred Contracts of America.
I know, and it's so kind of funny, isn't it? Because I mean, I've been working in Boston for like 10 years. I've been living down there, and I had kids that went through the school systems. Actually went through one of the schools that's a major founding school in this country, but as a public school. But the history that we learned way back when isn't quite like it when we learn it as an adult, because we get so much more perspective. And then the stories that are now available weren't available back then either. So
right. I think we dig deeper. We dig deeper into our history, and we look back and we see how sometimes it repeats itself, but in a different way, right?
Yeah.
And that's the whole intention of our show and what our teachings are, just to get you guys to think, because we've got to think. And oh boy, are you ready? Well, as many as you know, we love Carolyn Myss. She's our teacher, our mentor. Shelley and I met way back in 2006. I can't even believe it seems like a totally another era for us, which it was.
Yeah.
But we really bonded, and we just love all of Carolyn's teachings. And she wrote a whole series on the Sacred Contracts of America, which we're going to be referring to. Mm-hmm. And I really thought that it would be apropos to start this whole series with one of her quotes, but I've mixed it up. Oh. So I want you to think, because what I want to say is I want to set this intention. And I want to say to all of you out there, do you really want to look back on your life and see how wonderful it could have been had you not been afraid to live it? Make bold, courageous choices. Live as though you have the power to change the world, because you do. And that is from our esteemed and beloved teacher, Carolyn Myss, one of her many quotes. But I thought that, wow, how many of us, we just want to live our life. And now more than ever, we're looking and we're going in and we're saying, what's going to happen? Where are we going? And have I really lived the life that I've been meant to live? And if not, what are you going to do to change it? Because it only takes one person to change the world.
Yeah, right? Absolutely. Yeah. You get that little mustard seed kind of effect, and then the ripples go out, right? You have one really good, brilliant idea and people like, oh my God, that's a truth. That's a universal truth. They latch onto it. So one of the things that Shelley and I have been, throughout this whole series of our Evolve 360 show is we've had discussions, the common theme being, our relationship to power, right? Mm-hmm. And in many forms, power comes in many forms. So in our last episodes, we really kind of, dove in with different types of power. And power plays
the sexual power, which if you haven't heard that trilogy, whoo, it's hot to say the least, right? Woo.
Right? And we've also introduced many archetypes, and in particular the 4 survival archetypes, which are the child, the prostitute, the saboteur, and the victim. And in this series, we're going to discuss them too and how they play a major role in the development of a nation, which is kind of fascinating. We're like, okay, how did you jump, Shelley, how did you jump from the individual to a nation? Well, this series is going to explain all that.
We're intertwined.
Yes.
And let's face it.
Yeah.
We're part of what makes the fold of this country. I'm an immigrant, but I've totally assimilated and adapted, and I love America. I'm extremely patriotic, and I'm very passionate about the US of A. And it's interesting because we, as an outsider coming.
Oh, I lost you.
In, I can't. Yeah, I was a little kid when I came in, and the thing is that you kind of become part of the fold of this nation.
Yeah.
And that's what we want to talk about, because you're right. We went from the in, and now we're going to the out, the macro, and you'll see why. There's a reason for our sequencing of podcasts. So I can't wait to hear all about your Boston, because Shelley lives in Boston, and you're right there where it all took place.
It's such a fascinating, like how the birth of our nation started. It's so fascinating because it kind of is like, oh, how did that occur? And I think it even shocked, like back in the day, the people, the colonists, at how it unfolded. I don't think they expected completely the outcome that they got, especially in how things start. And sometimes we're not fully aware of, even though we might have a really good cause or really feel righteous in the direction that we're going into, we're still uncertain as to how it's going to unfold, and we don't know what the costs may be along the way as well. I mean, there were lives that people lost to gain this independence and this freedom that this country is noted for.
And change is hard. Let's face it. We don't. Yeah. It's hard to predict what's on the other side when you really don't know.
Yeah. And then these same forces, these archetypal forces, these 4 survival ones that we keep repeating about, are the same forces that, we use in our life, but they're also the same forces that help to birth and develop and evolve a country. They're with us as we grow our entire lives. And the same thing is with a nation, and it doesn't just mean America, it could be any nation, they still have to deal with these same archetypal forces, which is really, really fascinating. So, at the beginning of the show, I had introduced, that we're going to be speaking about the sacred contract of America. And what does that mean? What's a sacred contract? And what does that mean?
I know, what does that mean?
I know.
What does that mean?
Well, as our esteemed teacher Carolyn Myss would say, it comes from a question that we all as human beings at some point in our life ask ourselves or externally or to something, is like, why am I here? What was I born for?
What's your purpose?
What's my purpose?
Yeah.
What should I be doing? What's my mission here? What is life all about? Why am I here?
Right.
And this is a question that I think not just an American can ask themselves, but all people can ask themselves. And it's a very universal, common question. And it has to do with the soul. Mm-hmm. We're asking something from what's deep within ourselves, in our soul. And that's what we're asking for in a sacred contract, is getting in touch with that inner voice that may have the actual guidance that we follow through our intuition to come up with that particular contract.
And it's a guidance, because we have fate, which is what you came in through, which is what you're doing, and then your destiny, which is the fulfillment of your contract, which is through your soul. And we've got a whole episode on that coming up too.
Yeah, that's one of the that's I think the fourth one in this series. We'll be discussing that. But also, while we're going through stages of life, we don't want to be confused.
Right.
And if we have, if we know if we know where we're going in our life with some form of direction, then we can fulfill that destiny. But if we don't have those tools to figure that out, then we're kind of a bit lost. And that's what we're currently seeing, probably more so in not just our country here in the US, but throughout the world, is kind of a sense of misdirection, especially with this COVID-19 thing going on.
Well, and many times, you're going through your life, and all of a sudden, bam, like what happened with COVID-19, things get totally disrupted. And that's another way for us to wake up, basically, and have that conversation with our inner selves as to, geez, am I living the life that I really am meant to live?
Yeah.
And if not, you start searching, and you start going within, or you start seeking. You start looking at different ways, because all of a sudden you have the time. And I think with COVID, it's given us that pause where we're able to sit down, and we're not in that rat race of running all over the place. And
to figure,
do I really want to continue my life the way it is, or do I need to make some changes to better my health, better myself, better my relationships, that kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. To figure out, where am I going, and not face the consequences of just kind of willy-nilly going along and not having any direction and feeling unfulfilled, which leads to so many health problems that we see currently, so many emotional problems that we see currently, and so many being spiritually unfulfilled problems that lead to depression and all that. So that's part of the reason why Shelley and I are doing this series. It's not just, on this macro level of government, but it's also on the individual, because everything comes down to what we're feeling internally and how it becomes expressed outwardly. So we have to kind of bring this all together with this 360-degree view of yourself, and then what you do, because you're the mustard seed, baby. It's we're all together collectively on this planet, working as a whole, but we are to tap in together and work together. And that little mustard seed, which is the individual, can have that major impact and influence others in a positive light. If you're receiving a beam of light from source energy, God, whatever you want to call it, which is a little out there, and I know, but we're going to ground it. We're going to ground it.
We're going to ground it.
We're going to ground it.
Yeah.
There was an excerpt from Carolyn's book in the Sacred Contracts book, and it was from this late theologian, mystic, and Harvard professor. So if it comes from Harvard, man, you know.
It's law, right?
Yeah. Professor Howard Thurman, who often said there are two questions that we have to ask ourselves. The first is, where am I going? And then the second is, who will go with me? But if you don't have them in the right order, you're kind of going to be in trouble. You really have to have, where am I going? Who follows you is great, but you got to know, you got to have the guidance system. You got to have the direction.
You do, because if not, you're in constant chaos and turmoil and you don't get anything done.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I guess, the basics of a contract are, it's, your mission, it's what you're set here for doing. It's your overall relationship, as Shelley and I have been discussing all along the way, is power, your relationship to power, and the self-esteem or the soul, the personal power, and the spiritual or soul esteem that you build during that time, and to have that to fulfill whatever your destiny is as you move forward in your life.
Empower yourself and empower others in a positive way.
Exactly.
In a positive way.
Yeah. So how does that happen with a nation? Well, every nation has, it's birthed, and it has some form of, it comes into life. I mean, this country is free. I mean, if you go outside of the country, people would say that they know this country for freedom. They come here to be free, to live the American dream, which is a mythology. We'll get into that later. That's a sidebar, pinpoint that one. But they come here to be free and independent, to be able to live a certain lifestyle that they might not have been able to do wherever they came from.
And let's face it, America's always opened their arms to people that are politically persecuted. I mean, I know, because my parents and I came here, refugees. It's the land of opportunity. And if you talk to people that have immigrated to this country, they're always saying, this is a land of opportunity, this is freedom. And this is where we're going, so that everybody understands the contract that was created when America was created as a nation. Yeah. So there were patterns of energy or archetypal forces that were at play. The four that we've talked a lot about already are the prostitute, the saboteur, the child, and the victim. And when we look at how our country here, the United States of America, was birthed, a lot of that was kind of going on. You had your colonists that were, they came to this country and they developed 13 colonies, and there was a point where they felt like they were being not represented in the British government, and that they were being taxed, and they didn't like it. It's all about the money, isn't it?
It comes down to the money.
It always comes down to money. But what was interesting when we were doing our research is that each of these colonies were separate in and of itself. I always thought that everybody got along and it was one big, great, happy family. It wasn't that way at all.
No, they were all their own little separate countries. They had their own little things going on. And, they were pretty much happy. Some of them were happy with the way things were, and some pretty much weren't, some were taking a little more hit than others. They were being, it's like, the kids were restless here, say in Boston. in Boston, which is no surprise when I knowing living there for so many years. But they didn't like how Big Daddy, Big King George was treating them. And it comes down to this hierarchy. And when we came into this country, we didn't have kings and queens. We didn't have an aristocratic people.
I think they were trying to get away from that, weren't they?
Yeah, they were. They totally were. And it didn't show up here. This was free land. This was...
And anybody could be anything. You could be, no matter where you came from, no matter what color you were, you could be anything, basically.
Yeah, it was
right?
Seen that way, by settlers that actually came here. They could do their own thing, and they weren't really typically governed by anyone else. So when England came in and started these taxes, the people were like, hey, wait a minute, how come you're taxing us without representation? And they really didn't appreciate it, because they didn't feel respected. And back in Britain, in the homeland.
Right.
And which, like, can you imagine as a child, and you're trying to get your independence, and you trying to stand up to big old dad, and you're saying, hey, wait a minute, you're not giving me my allowance anymore.
You're like, no, you're not. And then I give it to you, you're going to have to, give it back. Or
something. And that's kind of what was happening. And they were saying, hey, wait a minute, we're free over here. What do we need you for anyways? And then, they had the stamp tax, which kind of set things off. And this is, what's fascinating about, before the Declaration of Independence got written, this is all like 5 years before any of that happened. So there's all this stuff percolating for years. And there's like a little kind of upset here, a little upset there, but there was several little upsets in the Boston area that took place. And it was kind of like a divorce, and we were leading into this disagreement of a divorce and separation from the homeland, from Britain.
Right.
Right. From the tyrant king, the patriarchal king, the hierarchy. We didn't want that here. We didn't want that aristocratic, entitled kind of attitude coming here to this new land.
No, and it's funny that you mentioned it like, imagine as Big Daddy and we're the kids. So since they separated and they wanted to have their own independence, they were considered orphan children. Yeah. Because the orphan doesn't have ties to really anybody. And they
want to adopt their own land. They want to create their own history. They want to do their own thing. They don't want that history. They don't want to lug it around. And believe me, too, as we get into this series, you're going to see there's a lot of history and a lot of things that didn't thrive, the complete soul of humanity that people here were trying to break away from.
Right.
That were already ingrained in culture, in European culture, in Asian culture, and like all these other cultures had these other dynamics going on.
They had dynasties, they had kingdoms, but that didn't apply to America, United States of America. We didn't have that. Everybody felt that they had a natural right to be free, and that's why they came here, basically. And I guess they got really upset when all of a sudden they're like, well, you guys are going to have to start sending money back home because we're going to start taxing you, right?
Yeah. There was a lot of, and in Boston, tensions ran really high. And this was like in the early 1770s. Like there was British soldiers coming in, and they were setting up camps on the Boston Common. Now, the Boston Common had kind of been there for a long time before. Like, I don't know who the house was that purchased the land there, but it was common land where they had cattle and stuff, and people would meet for certain meetings, and they also had hangings there too. I read that. I was like, wow, they hung people there in the common on this big old elm tree. I was like, oh my God, next time I'm down there, I got to go find where this was, because I had no idea.
We gotta share it with the viewers, because I've been there, but I haven't really, I've been there times, but I really haven't, I didn't know about that.
Yeah, they had like, religious kind of meetings, and the Sons of Liberty met there, and there's a lot of like history.
There's a lot of rich history in Boston.
There's a tremendous amount, and there's a lot of monuments in that area that are really historical, and it's really fascinating. And just in a short walk, like the Freedom Trail, and you can go to all these, like, it's a 2 mile something walk, and you can go down and you can find all these little places, and how it all began, how independence and how freedom came to this country. Just kind of, it's almost like a fluke, but how it actually did happen. But I have to say, though, too, is the colonists were prepared to protect themselves. They just didn't know that they would have to do it in such a regard, in the way that they did. I don't think they didn't think they'd actually have to go through with it. You know what I mean? I don't think they really believed that they were going to have to go through with certain things.
Well, I guess it's, again, that hesitation of change.
Yeah.
Because here, they had settled, they were still under British rule, and all of a sudden now they have to make a decision where they get divorced from the motherland, they cut them off, because are you going to start sending, money back home, or are you going to try and make a name for yourself? And I'm sure it was very hard for them when they settled.
Well, people were very loyal to Britain, so you had your colonists that were kind of rebelling against the taxes. It's kind of like, how we are today. It's like, yes, I agree with the president, or no, I don't agree with the president. There's things that were happening back then where, people were in agreement or disagreement about. And so you didn't really know how this would unfold. But the
Boston Tea Party, huh?
Yeah. Well, it's amazing. Like, at first in the 1770s, that, they had all these British soldiers, trying to referee 16,000 colonists throughout, like, the Boston, Massachusetts area, because they felt like the British felt like there's something percolating there. We're upsetting these people because of the Stamp Act and the tax and the Townshend Acts, and the colonists were like kind of miffed, because they were like, how come you're taxing us without representation? And they wanted to have that, so they felt kind of disrespected, and they were like, listen, this is not fair. And these British soldiers came to enforce those laws. And then what had happened in oh gosh, I think it was in March of 1770, there was the Boston Massacre. Now, this is how many years before, the Declaration? 6 years before. There was these colonists that came out. There was a British soldier, who was guarding the king's money in Boston. And he's, I kind of feel bad for the guy, but there's like, a group of colonists that come out, and they're like whipping snowballs at him, like with rocks in them, like ice balls. And so, he's trying to defend himself, and this scuffle breaks out, and some other British soldiers come in, and they fired shots. And then, of course, alarms went off in Boston, where you have colonists coming down. So it ends up turning out like, I think it was like, how many guys got killed? Like six guys or something got killed. And the first one was an indigenous, I think he was an African American.
Crispus Attucks, wasn't that?
Yes. He had racial heritage. Crispus Attucks, and he was killed. He was the first one. And so that's like, okay, first red flag for the colonists. They're like, okay, we're going to remember that,
Wow.
And then from there, Parliament turned around, well, they got us, it's like this back and forth kind of thing happening.
Right. Yeah.
It was like, okay, who's got power? This, they're
Power
fighting.
the wills. Right.
They're fighting for will powers.
Right.
Who's going to control what?
Right.
And it really comes down to that. Even with the king, like King George, I mean, even in the end, when we get all the way to the end, and he doesn't want to give us up, and he was, like, it's fascinating, but it's all this egotistical kind of power plays that are happening here, and it does come down to finances in a high regard, but also it's amazing. So this brought to the head this American representation in Parliament, which wasn't happening, and then after that it led to the Boston Tea Party.
Oh, I remember that.
Which was them being taxed again. Now, meanwhile, like, this is happening in Boston, and these other like towns that are, maybe 15, 20 miles away, and the other colonies are all listening to what's going on up in Boston. And what takes place eventually is they're saying, well, if it can happen there, what's it going to keep from happening here? That's
true, because I'm sure that they were getting victimized and they were being put in jail if you were doing some upheaval.
Well, that's what they were doing. They were trying to police. They were trying to police these colonists, and it kind of led to one thing after another, which I don't think even the colonists expected it to unravel the way it did.
But they were declared traitors, weren't they? So imagine.
Yes, they were considered traitors. So the British were out looking to arrest people, and anybody that was inciting, this kind of rebelliousness against, the British rule and the king. And, it led to the Boston Tea Party, which really miffed the king. So then there was, more.
His money was all thrown overboard.
Yeah, right? They're like, what?
Yeah, it's all about the money.
Yeah. So, which forced the closure of Boston Harbor after that. So now it's like the colonists are like, okay, you're taking away our trade.
Exactly. And I think they took away their charter too, right?
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah. So I can just imagine.
Yeah.
And when they take away their trade, it was their jobs and their livelihood, because I'm sure now they had to figure out where they were going to get money from.
Yeah.
So it was like a domino effect, really.
Yeah. There's no win here. There's no win. I mean, like, it's as a major ruler say, like, it's like, did you really think that was going to work out?
Crazy.
By force and domination and what have you. Our history tells us that does not work.
Right.
So then from there, it led to this whole, like, 1,000 redcoats or so on the Boston Common that were sent out, to, like, if they heard any inklings of any maybe little cells uprising
stuff, right?
Yeah, like if they heard anything, they would go out on these excursions outside of Boston to, find gunpowder or cannons or guns or anything like that. And so they would go out and they wouldn't find anything. So then they come back to Boston, but they were kind of just holding, fort and making sure they were putting up, the redcoats were putting in a presence in Boston.
I can just imagine what they look like, all in red, and just, they must
have with the
a force to reckon, right?
Yeah. And their guns, I mean, they were huge, they were the British, army or whatever. They were like,
and face it, they had money because they were being funded by the king.
Yeah.
Whereas the colonists, really, they were starting anew. They weren't organized, and they really didn't have.
Well, they didn't. I mean, it's not like they had gun, stuff for warfare. They didn't. They had to kind of acquire that. They had to. They had to acquire those things. Muskets, like a turkey musket or something like that. That's what they were probably using, or pitchforks and axes and and that sort of thing for weapons. So to have a cannon, that was a big thing. So I guess word got out, though, that it was kind of somebody, I don't know, General Gage. This was in, like, I think 1775. I think, yeah. So this is getting closer to, you know, stuff going down where we're really going to declare our independence. But apparently they were going to do this march out to Lexington and Concord and check this tip that they got. And it was just kind of it wasn't really a tip. It was probably some drunken guy saying something to someone. And then they were like, oh, wow, a cannon? What? You know, like, and, you know, it was just kind of an obscure thing. But what had happened is in April 1775, they decided to march out to Lexington and Concord from the Boston Common. And General Gage ordered, you know, a militia to go out there, or not a militia, the Redcoats. And so what was really fascinating is we had the colonists had a strategic, like an alarm. You know, it wasn't like getting on the cell phone and saying hello, but this really worked. They had, okay, if the British are coming, you know, in the north church, you know, 1 if by land, 2 if by sea. They put the light in the steeple at the old North Church. Well, so apparently this is like, you know, Charlestown, the North End, kind of looking over like the harbor and everything. And so apparently they got a warning, and so Paul Revere and William Dawes.
The Redcoats are coming.
The Redcoats are coming. All right. So but you know, people just think he got on a horse.
A horse, exactly. That's what we were taught.
Simple journey. It was like, no, they took off in different directions. These 3 guys took off in different directions.
That's fascinating.
And one went by, like, they kind of maneuvered and went past, like, the British that were on, like, sailboats on the Charles River. And then they got on a horse, like Paul Revere got on a horse and then rode off. And they all met in Lexington. And one of the big things was the Redcoats also wanted to get John Adams and John Hancock, who were kind of like inciting all this stuff, you know, like getting people, you know, saying, hey, why should we be doing this?
Getting people riled up.
Getting people, why should we
wake up and think,
right? We shouldn't be putting up with this stuff. This is, you know, we're free men, man. We can think for ourselves. We don't need to be governed.
Exactly.
So they got there and they warned John Adams and John Hancock, who went into hiding in Billerica, which is about a half hour north of Boston. And in Burlington, they hid out there, but then they had to get to Concord because that's where this cannon, or like some sort of cannon, was buried or something, or being in hiding. And there was all this gunpowder, and most of the guys along the way, they already knew that had all been taken care of, and people took care of it and had it in hiding.
Okay.
But when they got when the British got to Lexington, there was a Captain John Parker who was there, and he had like his own guys with him, his militia, the American, you know, like the townspeople. And he said, I don't want any of you firing, but, you know, be ready. I don't want any of you firing on the Redcoats, because he didn't want to lose his men for something that wasn't worth losing, because he knew that they wouldn't find anything, and that they would eventually end up turning around and going back to Boston, because they had done these kind of excursions before.
Got it.
But the funny thing about this Captain John Parker, now he was in the French. He was like a lieutenant or something in the
French Revolution.
Yeah, the French and Indian War.
Okay.
So he had some background in warfare from like how they fought that war.
Like strategic planning.
Yes. But the other thing is he had tuberculosis. So he could not his voice was raspy. So this is kind of an important thing, okay? So when
these were brave men, I can't believe he.
Yeah, so and you can see how this kind, yeah, you can see how
this a revolution.
This stuff unfolds, is like the chaos that ensues.
So they couldn't hear him very well because his voice was raspy.
And you couldn't hear him clearly, maybe what he was saying.
That's
don't fire, unless they fire on you.
Okay. And so what happened?
So what had happened is the British are coming over, and they're kind of supposedly at a standoff. But Captain Parker had his men kind of staggered in I'd say probably not a non-threatening, but they were standing there kind of waiting to see what the British soldiers would do. Mm-hmm. And he figured, we haven't declared war against these people. This is our home. This is our own countrymen that we may be fighting, even though they're from England. But we don't want to start this up. And so apparently the British commander came, he's on a horse or whatever, and he's shouting for both commanders are shouting not to fire, but somehow some shots went off, and what's fascinating is historians aren't really clear as to what happened. They don't know who said what. You can't really find anything definitive because the stories are all different. And some think that, a British soldier was firing after somebody who escaped their custody, and then that was sounded off, or somebody behind one of the buildings shot a gun off. They don't really know. But then what eventually happened was, this was the shot that was heard around the world. Right. Sparked everything. Is that I guess several men, American militiamen, colonists, were shot, and the British marched through there, and they kind of the Parker and his men dispersed and hid and tended to their wounds. Okay. While the British ended up marching through, and they went on to Concord. So the fascinating thing is how did all these other towns hear about this? That is fascinating. Well, yes, because some were 15, 20 miles away. One, New Hampshire actually heard this. Wow. Connecticut heard this. All these other places were hearing what was going on in, Lexington and Concord are about 15 to 20 miles outside of Boston. Okay. And that was a long ways back then. Yeah. Well, so they're marching from the early morning out into this area, these British soldiers, and they're going to Concord, and they get to Concord on this bridge, and they're in the town of Concord, and they're going through this tavern and this meeting house, and they're looking for weapons of whatever. And I think they started to burn some stuff, and the fires caught onto the meeting house. And so there's these other colonists that came to the North Bridge in in Concord, and they're watching, and they're like, oh God, what are we going to do? Do we go down? Do we defend the town? And other places now are getting alarmed, because it wasn't just like going back to Paul Revere and William Dawes. Paul Revere got captured in Lexington, and William Dawes fell off his horse. So the only one that got through to warn Concord was this Samuel, what was his name? Preston or something. This is fascinating, And he got there to warn them, and then from there, all these colonists are banging drums. They're setting big bonfires. So it's alerting all these towns all over the place. So it's like, I'm on my phone, and the internet happening through these very primitive ways. But all these people caught word. Now, this is really important, because even though there was the battle in Lexington and Concord, these British soldiers had to get back to Boston to safety. because they were out away and they only had
How far away was that? 20 miles?
Yes, something like that, 25,
Wow.
something like that. So they had to get back to Boston, where General Gage is, and they didn't leave Boston with the proper amount of ammunition for what they were going to entail, and they didn't have that military support that they were going to need when all these colonists are coming in from all over the place.
Wow.
So it turned into this major problem for the British.
A defining moment, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was a defining moment for the British where they really blundered and caused an uprising, especially where they set fire to this village, this settlement. And so people, the colonists are watching this, and they're over by a bridge, and they're like, whoa. And so the British had to leave that town, had to come back over that bridge, and the colonists, there was a standoff at this North Bridge.
Wow.
And what apparently happened was somebody with a tomahawk hit one of the British and scalped them.
Oh my gosh.
And I don't know if that's an actual real true, but it's been documented. And is it a myth? Is it a real story? Did it really happen? I don't know, but wow. It's a fascinating it supposedly sparked these British now when they were on their way back, going into homes, because what was happening is the colonists were hiding behind things like trees and in the woods and firing at the British. They weren't doing like what the British do, and they stand in the formation and then they ching, and then they fire and they walk.
In war.
Yeah, they had guerrilla warfare tactics like they had in the French and Indian War.
Right, exactly. And they were up against just regular townspeople and farmers that wanted to make sure that their land was taken care of,
was protected and taken care of. But they were fighting a different tactile war, which frustrated the British, because they were like, how come they're not being honorable and standing up to us and facing us? Instead, they're behind trees and behind taverns and buildings, and they're firing us that way, so we have no control. So it really hurts them. So on their way back, when they're traveling back, they're going into people's homes. The British now are going into people's homes.
Oh, no.
And killing whoever's there.
Wow.
Bayoneting them, killing them, rummaging through their things. So this is inciting even more,
people are getting angry.
Bad blood.
Angry. Right.
Yeah, bad blood. And on the trails back, you have other Minutemen. This is Minutemen came into play. Right. As they're on the trails, and they would strategically set up so when the British came through, they were pummeling them with and wow. It was, I guess, the British lost a lot of people, like a lot of their soldiers. Wow. And there was a lot of discord, between what the British just didn't have the skill to figure out who was coming, and they just kept getting pummeled, and they were exhausted because they had been traveling for
they underestimated the colonists.
They totally did.
Yeah, they underestimated the colonists.
Yeah. So it's fascinating, and then the real fascinating thing comes is once they get the British get back to Boston, and then the Americans, the colonists are like, they had enough strategy to put together. They took accounts, like written accounts and testimonials from everybody at different locations, because they really they felt victimized by the British soldiers. Wow. And they played that victim kind of role because they didn't want to, they felt like they were innocent. They were like, they fired on us and we're just trying to defend ourselves and defend our homes.
Right.
And so they had a plan already in place where they took down eyewitness accounts, had hundreds of them, wrote them down, and then got them on a boat and shipped it to England.
Oh, wow.
And
That's very interesting that they did that.
Yeah, they had a really fast boat. I don't know which boat it was, but they had a fast boat. And meanwhile, General Gage, who's back here dealing with the aftermath of losing all his redcoats and trying to figure out what the heck happened, what went wrong, how did we blow it?
Yeah, against a bunch of farmers, right?
Yeah, and he was taking accounts from the British soldiers, which they were saying they were so frustrated by the colonial militia, had fired at them from behind trees and stone walls rather than confronting them in large linear
Honorably, yeah,
formation in a style of European warfare. I'm like, well, hell no. This is America. It's not Europe.
right. Pomp and circumstance, right?
Yeah. Right? But
meanwhile, they're taking away your property and your homes and everything, and they want a sense of decorum. That's very interesting.
Yeah, and so we got some sympathy from, not that London didn't have, they didn't particularly care for the colonists at all, but we did get some sympathy from, say, the reporters or journalists that reported this because of the 100 or so documented testimonials of people. But the funny thing is everybody appeared, back then when the testimonials were first taken, they seemed more as victims and innocent. And then 10 years later, somebody went in and took testimonials from them, and they were like, no, we weren't having it. We were standing our ground.
Oh, really?
They kind of changed. They still, and then before they said, we don't know who shot first. Where later they said the British shot first and we fired back to defend ourselves.
That's very interesting. Probably because of fear. They were afraid.
Well, I think they didn't know that this was the path that they were going to take, and then in hindsight, after that, like 2 months later, then they had the Battle of Bunker Hill, which we lost. The British took over Bunker Hill or Breed's Hill, but the British lost actually quite more men than what we lost, and it turned out it wasn't really a strategic, the greatest strategic holding place for the British. They ended up surrendering that later on in the war when George Washington came into the picture, and they set up camp, I think, in Dorchester and in Dorchester Heights, and which was a better location for how the revolution would start, and then which leads into the whole the Declaration of Independence. But we were gaining support. I mean, Washington came up from Virginia after hearing about this Lexington and Concord thing, and it went around like several different leaders from the different colonies were like watching, and I think they started to see, okay, what's the difference between Boston and say our community or our colonies? Are the British soldiers going to come back and now start treating us unfairly and showing force in our neighborhoods or in our cities or towns? So
that's a good point, because they were there because they wanted freedom.
Yeah.
They wanted freedom, and now they were, it's like, now we're here, but now it's happening all over again, where we're going to be, we're not going to have our freedom. We're going to have to pay all these taxes that we don't believe in. And
yeah. So I mean, it's a fascinating tale, but it basically started a few days of these little or what seemed to be something that might be insignificant, but that turns into something that's majorly significant, and people look and they're like, hey, that's not right. And then and they're fed up, and it's the turning point. And that shot in Lexington when the British.
So you think that was like the straw that broke the camel's back? That Lexington. Yeah. Where people said, well, maybe they took notice, and they're like, we better start doing something because if this is happening, and it's all about empowerment, empowering yourselves, and just understanding that you have to have a stand. Sometimes you have to take a stand and speak up.
Yeah.
And not allow others to.
Yeah, it's amazing, because once after that happened, like New Hampshire got involved.
Right.
Connecticut, like these other states were like totally behind Massachusetts and said, yeah, we're with you. And then
Right.
too, George Washington came up from Virginia, and he was like, he he was involved, like,
No. Yeah.
and it's amazing.
It
It's
is,
so
and
amazing.
that's a fascinating story, which we're going to leave for the next episode. But I just love that story of how
Yeah,
everything kind of just unraveled for him,
yeah,
because
yeah.
things weren't going well for him at all, you know.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So, I mean, it's fascinating that, we put our, because of the actions that happened in Boston, there was this I, I, idealistic kind of visionaries that were, yes, all men can be free and all men can be independent. And there was this new American Enlightenment that happened, and I think it's centered kind of in Boston about educating people,
Right.
and part of the schools. Benjamin Franklin went to one of the schools. It was like the first public school in
Hmm.
Roxbury Latin in the country. It's the
Right.
oldest public school in the country,
Uh-huh.
and it was all about these men that, which we're going to talk about in our next
Yeah.
episode, is these enlightened visionaries that really brought in a lot of light, but they were very highly educated people
Right.
that just brought in this whole idea of bringing in freedom for the soul to expand, and that's what the Constitution is about.
And the ideals that all men are created equal, because that's really what it's about.
Yeah,
Their
yeah,
idealism.
yeah,
Yeah, it's
yeah. the
very
soul
interesting.
and the soul
Right.
in this country, it was given the permission here to thrive,
Right.
on earth, and that no man governs, another man. Like we were shooting for man being able to govern himself. We knew that couldn't happen, because not everybody can be trusted to do that, sadly. But that was the whole premise of building this nation, and it started with this whole, breaking away from Big Daddy,
Right.
the King of England, King
And
George.
it's basically their ideals was government by the people for the people. It wasn't
Yeah,
to be governed like they
yeah,
had been in England. Or it
yeah,
was more like by the people for
yeah,
a better world, a better ideal, freedom. It's
yeah,
very interesting how the stories all take us to where we are today.
yeah,
And
sure,
we're going to take our viewers and our listeners through down that trail, because
yeah,
it's fascinating of
yeah.
how things has transpired, and where we are now with what's going on in our world. So, and how that's
Yeah,
affecting us.
yeah, it's amazing. It
Yes,
is
it is.
amazing. And our plan is to bring, everything that's in the past up to the present, and
Hmm.
to see the US Constitution and the brilliance of it, but also to bring it forward
Right,
into its next phase.
right. Or get everybody to thinking of what's next.
Yeah, what
Because
is
that's our
next?
whole, how are we going to evolve 360? Evolve
Yeah,
yourself and evolve your world.
yeah,
And that's why we wanted to start with that quote that it only takes one person to change the world.
mm,
And we're here to help and, guide people along this journey and just share our thoughts and our experiences and some of our beliefs to get you guys thinking. That's what this podcast is all about.
yeah. Yeah, so in our next show, Shelley and I are going to
Ooh,
bring to light the esoteric influences and the 8 archetypal forces or patterns that shaped our country. So we're going to get more into the history, but we're going to talk about some of the founding fathers and the influences those had, as well as the archetypal forces that are in play with the development of our country, but also still active today.
Very active. That's
and that's a whole kind of really cool, fun thing. And then
great.
some of the other ones we are going to discuss in the one after that is the sins of this country and how we need to kind of come through that, and then what the fate and destiny is, and then how we go from there. So I hope you'll, Shelley and I hope you're gonna hang on with us and listen to this series, because it's a great, astounding one, and lead to new, we want to stimulate your thinking, and it can lead to new adventures and a new paradigm for this country and globally, the world, and yourself. Exactly. So we want to thank you for joining us in this episode, an introduction to the sacred contracts of America. And if you enjoyed the show, please leave a review, because it helps people find the show. And then also mention what might have motivated or inspired you. And then never miss an episode of Evolve 360 show by remembering to subscribe or download either on iTunes, or you can follow us.
We're on 7 platforms now.
Oh my, yeah, we're like, you can watch us on YouTube, and then Facebook.com Evolve 360 Life. You can find us there. But this is
Cheli Grace
and Shelley Devine with Life Unplugged, Raw and Real. We'll see you on the next Evolve 360. Thank you so much.
And thanks for all our listeners that have been, sending us great responses, that you love the show. And, we just want to hear more about you guys and how we can help you move forward.
So thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.